Today I'm talking with Dr. Jane Warren, who is a lecturer in the Early Years program at the University of Wollongong. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
That's good. Can you tell us about your research and also your work in the early childhood field?
Sure. I think one of the things to start with is, as an early childhood teacher, I guess you start researching from that minute you walk in the door. And so many moons ago, when I started as an early childhood teacher, I guess I started developing an interest in knowing more, because you realise how much you've learned, but also how much you still need to learn. And so I started really thinking about how much more I could contribute, and particularly became interested in the area of inclusion of children with disabilities, because we had a number of children with disabilities, and I always felt that there was more I could be doing. It's interesting though, because there was never a question about whether they were enrolled, depending on support needs, didn't make any difference. However, I just always felt there was more that I could be doing. So that kind of led me to doing some postgrad study, and then sort of evolved my interest in inclusion of children with disabilities. So it sort of started from a very practical base, and then I've been involved in supported playgroup for children with disabilities as well. And so hearing a lot of the stories from parents and things that were challenges for parents around accessing early childhood really made me think about from the parent perspective as well. So my research interests have sort of evolved into looking at really how to include children authentically in early childhood services, and from the perspective of the educators and also the parents, because sometimes those align and sometimes they don't. But I think also, it's very much a social justice perspective that every child should be included, but it's how we can kind of build capacity in educators to increase their confidence, increase their experience, so that a child with a disability, irrespective of support needs, is just another child in the service. So I guess that's kind of where my research interests all lie. So that had led me, my doctoral research was around that, parent and teacher perspectives around inclusion. And so since then I've kind of, all of my research projects have been around similar things, so very much around building capacity in early childhood educators.
Yeah, and as I understand it, with a particular focus on the transition for children from home to a setting, either a school setting or an early childhood setting. So let's focus on how parents feel about that transition and how they perceive that transition happening and what their experience is.
Well, I think we all know transitions can be challenging, and we've all experienced different transitions even recently that sort of unnerve you, I suppose, because it's an unknown. And I think one of the things, there's a lot of research around transition to school, less research around transition to school for children with disabilities, but there is a lot of research about that because it's really recognised as an important transition in children's lives and also for the parents as well. But the actual transition into early childhood centres wasn't a particularly well-researched area. So what seemed to happen was that it's almost like you just go. And it's, for parents of children with disabilities, because it's not compulsory education, a lot of those parents choose not to because they don't know whether it's the right place for their child. But the other thing is that unfortunately sometimes parents of children with disabilities can phone a centre that has a place for their child until they mention the disability, and then there isn't a place for their child, or it becomes a much more difficult process. And that's really unfortunate, because from that minute then the parents think, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. So then all the benefits of early childhood that early childhood centres for all children aren't necessarily given to all children. And so then obviously there's ripple effects to that parents can become more isolated because they're not having the same opportunities. So the transition into early childhood centres is really important because it sets up the rest of the inclusion. So if the transition is positive, it's about helping parents to realise that this is the right place for their child. So parents can be quite anxious about, all parents can be anxious sending their child to an early childhood centre anyway, but particularly if your child's not verbal or your child has high support needs from a medical perspective, there's a whole lot of additional things that those parents have to consider. And so the trust that you need to put in people, the amount of effort that it takes for parents to actually think about that being a good option for them, it's a much more difficult process. So I think that transition period, whatever that looks like, because it's not the same transition period for everyone, but whatever that transition period looks like really sets the inclusion up.
Yeah, so when children are transitioning, I mean, often an early childhood setting is the first time when a child leaves that home environment and moves into something outside of the home. So if we're looking at a good transition, what does an educator need in terms of their knowledge and their skills to make that transition smooth?
Well, I think educators, it's okay for educators to recognise that they're not going to know. If they have never encountered a child with that particular disability, they're not expected to know. But we know parents are the experts on their own children, and we need to remember to talk to parents, to ask questions, to voice our concerns, to find out from parents what things work, what things don't work. So obviously, when you speak about children with disabilities, one child with a disability and another child with a disability are not the same people. Even within the same diagnosis, they're so different. But what we need to think about is having conversations with parents. But the first thing is reassuring parents that this is the right place for your child. We 100% want your child to be enrolled here. We just need to have lots of conversations and do some planning to make sure it's an effective transition and to make sure that your child's included. Because that's what every parent wants their child to be included. Nobody wants their child just enrolled and then, parked in a corner or left wandering around the perimeter of a service while everybody else just actually has opportunities. So we really need to, early childhood educators really need to share their concerns with parents, to talk about things. And I think sometimes people worry about that because they feel like, are they coming across as being discriminatory, asking questions? But you have to ask the questions to know then how to include the child. So of course educators can observe every child and get to know every child from their own perspective. But sometimes that takes longer if a child has high support needs, that we can't see some of those things ourselves as quickly. So we need to have those conversations with parents.
So for a family going into an early childhood setting or even a school setting, I mean, times have changed in terms of inclusion, and it might look different these days to what it looked like in the past. What does early childhood education look like for children and those children with particular needs?
Well, I think early childhood education, there's so much research about the importance of the first 5 years and the opportunities and the benefits of high quality early childhood. And those benefits should be afforded to all children, not just children who fit into a typical development kind of box. And we need to think about early childhood educators, all the documents, all the legislation, it's not about one group of children and not another group of children. So our National Quality Framework gives us guidelines of how we should be with people, and it's not about one kind of person or another kind of person or a cultural perspective or a disability perspective. It's about every child having the right to be included. So what we need to think about is, first of all, everything that you do for typically developing children should be the opportunities that are given to children with disabilities as well. And it's not about having something different for the children with disabilities. It's about how to adapt or modify. What are the considerations for those children to then be included with their typically developing peers. So it's not about a separate curriculum because you have a disability. It's not about a separate thing. Every child has different likes and dislikes, so not every child wants to do the same thing. But if a child, for example, with a physical disability wants to be going down a slippery dip, then early childhood educators need to make that work. If it's a child who is on the autism spectrum and doesn't like groups, that's okay, don't push them into the group, but also don't just say, well, they don't like groups, so we'll just leave them to wander at that time, because then they're not getting any of the benefits of that. So it's about looking at how can we put supports in place to maximise children's actual participation, not just them being there, because there's a really big difference between enrolment and inclusion.
Yes.
And that's what educators really have a responsibility for.
Yeah, so real engagement, real inclusion
absolutely.
in that program. So what are some good questions that a parent or family member could ask when they're seeking a place in an early childhood setting?
I think coming from their own child's perspective to start with, and what are the things that your child either has challenges with, what do you know your child's strengths are, what do you know your child's likes and dislikes are, and if those aren't evident to the early childhood educators, sharing those things, and actually then maybe spending some time in the centre and looking at the routine of the service, looking at what happens in that service each day, and then thinking about your own child, and then asking questions about how that would work for their child. So, if it is something, so for example, if it's a child who is tube fed, then, well, what does morning tea look like? So that child, it's not about eating at the same time as the other children necessarily. It's about what's morning tea for. Morning tea is not just food. Morning tea is for a social engagement. And eating is a social event. So the child who is tube fed might not need to eat at that time, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be with that morning tea with the other children. But then the parent would need to know, so for their nutrition, how's that going to work in the service? So thinking about those kinds of things. The other thing is also really thinking about if the child has additional therapists, if the child has additional people that are part of their kind of roadmap, how does that work within the centre? So there's lots of supports in place now for those kinds of things. So there's a working together agreement that's established from what was Early Childhood Intervention Australia, and to support therapists maybe going into the service to support a child in the service, and also helping to build capacity in the educators. Because the hard thing for early childhood educators is that there's so many demands on them every day. So there's people saying, you need to do better sustainability practices. Hang on, visual arts isn't good enough. Hold on, the music program here needs more work. There's health and safety things. There's so many demands on early childhood educators. But I think if you can always step back and think about the rights of every child and start from that perspective, everything doesn't have to be rushed to cram everything into every day, but every child's right should be respected every day. And if you kind of start from that, then it kind of helps you to think, well, so how do we make this work? It's not about can we make it work, it's about how.
Yeah, so it's keeping the child very much at the centre of that
Absolutely.
story. So in terms then, there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. So in terms of then the child's voice in this, how can we hear the child's voice in this transition process, and how can we support that?
Well, I think it's about the child's voice in the transition, and it's about the child's voice every day in the centre as well. And every child has a voice, whether they physically have a voice they can use or not, but every child should be able to contribute. So again, it's about working out how to get that child's voice. Now, sometimes that might be, their voice might come through from their eyes. So, for example, making a choice. Do they want to play with this or play with this? If the child has really limited mobility, isn't verbal, they can't point to those things even to tell you what they want to play with, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to have a choice. So then it's about looking, well, okay, talking to the parent, can they use their eyes to look? And it might be a matter of you having to take more time to actually hold the things closer and say, do you want to play with the ball or do you want to play with the block? And then actually really looking at the child's eyes and watching where the child's eyes go, and then saying to the child, okay, you're looking at the ball, so I think you want to play with the ball. So then trying to read cues, like we learn to do with young babies. They also don't have a voice that uses words, but we can learn to read their cues, and that's what we need to do with children with disabilities. Also, again, it's about the parent, respecting the parent's contribution to that. And I think we often do end up having quite significant relationship with parents of children who have higher support needs, because you have to have more conversations. And don't think about that as parents being demanding. Think about that's something to help meet the needs of the child. So if you again go back to the child as being the centre, it's not about, I'm going to have another conversation. But that's what you need to find out, and it's finding out, well, when the child makes this noise, are they telling me this or are they telling me this?
Yeah.
And that might be about creating a kind of a communication dictionary where you all write down, what does this noise mean? What does this mean? So all the educators in the centre recognise them. It's just like learning the child's language, whether it's sign language or whether it's some noises or whether it's movement of eyes or whatever it is. It's about learning the child's language and then being able to understand what messages the child's trying to give you.
Yeah, that's some great tips for educators there. In terms of inclusion staff, sometimes services are funded additional amounts for additional workers who are focused on inclusion. For a family, what can they expect in that environment?
I think sometimes that's a challenge for families because families often think if you have another educator, that educator should be with my child all the time. And while a key worker model is great so that the parents have a key person that they can go to, an additional educator isn't just about being there to shadow one child. And there's a lot of philosophical reasons for that because if you just have one person with one child, in a way it's not supporting inclusion in any way because it's almost like they can go off and do their own things and that person really needs to be maximising the involvement of the children with other children. The other issue though is if you have one educator that stays with one child, you don't necessarily build capacity within the team. So it's all well and good if that person's there, but if they're not there one day, does that mean the child can't be there? So I think having a key worker is really important, and it depends on the child's support needs. So there are particular children who actually need someone with them all the time. Then it may be that that a worker needs to be with that child all the time. But really good practice in a service would be about sharing that kind of role. So the extra staff member means that you can rotate around staff members that the child is most comfortable with and build capacity in all those educators. But it also it offers different things to the children. You know that different educators do different things, they do things in different ways. So it's allowing that child to have more opportunities. Yes. But it's also just really good practice to really engage other children in everything that you're doing. And so you really want to make sure that you look at the philosophy of your own service and then look at how that works in the service. And for educators to be confident enough to voice those things as well, whether it is about an extra staff member coming in or whether it's about a therapist coming in, maintain the philosophy of your service and talk to people about how that's going to work in your service.
So we've both used the word inclusion in particular ways, and I think that sometimes we have the expectation that that's easy to understand, but what does inclusion actually mean?
That's a really interesting thing, and there's lots of definitions around inclusion. And I always think that ultimately really think about yourself. When you feel included, what does it mean? And so inclusion is about authentic participation. Inclusion is about being actively involved, and active doesn't need to be physically active. Being actively involved in lots of different aspects in the service. Inclusion means about being valued for your contributions. It's about being recognised for who you are and the opportunities that are given to everybody. And I think one of the really important things, and I like to kind of use the term about building an inclusive culture in your service, because it's not about, inclusion's not something you do, it's about something that you believe. And so, if people say, we do inclusion, you're probably not, because it's an add-on, and it shouldn't be an add-on, it should be embedded in everything that happens throughout the day. So building an inclusive culture isn't just about the educators being inclusive either. It's about having a culture in your service that children automatically become inclusive. And I think when we think about the first 5 years of children's lives and all of the things we know that if they develop, that foundation is going to go with them a long way. So are children's attitudes. So if children develop really positive attitudes and recognise inclusion about valuing every single person and including everyone in different parts of the day, that then travels with them, which then makes, down the track, inclusion so much better. So I think, the main things is kind of about that authentic participation, and just that valuing everybody for who they are, that everybody contributes different things, but sometimes when there's children with disabilities, people forget that, and it's a separate thing. It's not a separate thing. Every child's different.
Yes. So it's philosophically driven, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So what would you say to a family who is tossing up whether to seek out early childhood education and have their child participate?
I think one of the important things is for parents, and irrespective of whether a child has disability or not, is to go and visit some of the local early childhood services and find a place that you feel comfortable. I guess the unfortunate thing is that that sometimes it might not be the centre that's closest to where you live, but that's the same for everybody. You naturally, if you or I went into the same early childhood centre, we wouldn't necessarily feel exactly the same way, and that's okay. So I think parents to go and have a look at some services, take their child and think about their child in that service and talk to the educators. The other thing is for parents, if they've got the opportunity to talk to other parents of children with disabilities and where they've gone and the benefits for their children. It is a really important thing for parents to recognise that that early childhood does provide so many opportunities for children, and if the parents, every parent at some point you go, I don't know if I'm brave enough for that, but you just have to take that leap. But I think recognising that, it's your child. So if you want to spend more time in the service, getting used to the service, it's not just about your child, it's about you as well. But I would definitely encourage parents to go and visit. And if they've got other support people that, sometimes it is hard because you sort of feel like you need someone to reflect with and think, is this the right place or whatever. So if there is someone else in the family who could go with a parent, or if it's another parent they know or someone they've met through a supported play group, for example, that then they can go and ask some questions, or even talk to someone beforehand and say, what kind of questions should I ask? And that might be, you might have a conversation like that with a GP or a therapist, and ask people questions. There are centres that have different reputations for different things. However, I also don't think you should restrict to going somewhere just because somebody else thinks, because it's not necessarily the right place for you.
Well, also too, Jane, somebody may come across a centre with someone who's really interested in children with disabilities, just as you were when you were starting out in your career, and there's a real drive then for someone in that role to research and understand and connect with families. So there could be a real gem there for a family.
And I think that's an interesting point too. Sometimes people think, and I know from my doctoral research, there were parents that did feel more comfortable if people had experience. And while I can see I can see why, and often when people have experience, they do bring something else to a role. But I do think back to when I first started, and I was a 21-year-old straight out of uni. I don't think I could have been more enthusiastic about that. And it's not about what it's about what you're willing to learn. And I still, in my role in supported playgroup, I learn things every week that then I'm fortunate enough to be able to bring that back to my teaching at uni and share that with students. But I also think that it's really about recognising that there's so many different things. There's so many different things different centres offer. And so for parents to go and just talk to someone, and yourself, you can meet someone and straight away you're comfortable with them or you're not. And parents need to recognise what those kinds of feelings are as well. And if you're not happy there, then it's okay to voice those concerns and talk to people about what you're not happy with.
That's great. So the last question I have for you is, how can people find out more information, parents, for example, find out information about where to go, and also how can educators find out more information around inclusion?
So there's a couple of things there. I guess word of mouth is a great thing for parents. So if they do have access to other parents, then talking to other parents, because parents of children with disabilities, while I'm not suggesting that if you have a child with Down syndrome, you want to be best friends with another person who has a child with Down syndrome, there are things that may be concerns that a parent has that their best friend with children doesn't understand. If your child's tube fed, for example, you might not have a friend who has a child who's tube fed, so you can't ask those questions. So finding people who have links to the things and understand. So whether it's a GP, whether it's maybe it's your local early intervention service, your early childhood early intervention partner. It might be one of those organisations that you're part of. It might be a paediatrician that you speak to. It might be a therapist, and you talk about some of your concerns about going to early childhood. And then when you go to services, find out, from the services, and they should be able to provide additional links to information as well. So there are also places like Early Childhood Intervention Australia that's just been rebranded, but they offer a lot of free information around transition. They offer a lot of free information on websites around things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, early intervention services. So there's lots of things like that. But I think one of the other things is for parents of children with disabilities, they're not excluded from all the information that's available for all parents. So, parents have similar concerns often whether their child has a disability or not. So accessing any information, whether it's through, even professional development type stuff, that's parent series that are available, even so some of the things that have been available through here, that offer parents additional information and additional perspectives. If you are in an early childhood centre, I think parents can then say, I would like more information about this. Do you know of someone? And hopefully early childhood services tapping into their own networks, because there are centres who then might have a link to someone. Places can always contact someone, for example, in early years at the university and go, we want to know more about this, what do we do? And that's happened to us a number of times. And it's a great thing to be able to share with early childhood educators as well, so that everybody can keep building their capacity. And I mean, we do it all the time. It's certainly not a case of us working here, so we don't need to learn. We learn constantly. And I think it's about recognising that sort of thing is something that's ongoing.
Yeah, and that's a great offer from the early years team. So thanks, Jane. And thanks very much for talking with me today.
Okay, thank you very much, Leanne.